In the heart of Bentonville, Arkansas, where Walmart's corporate towers cast long shadows over quiet suburban streets, there lived a 6-year-old girl who believed in princesses. Her name was Jersey Dianne Bridgeman, and though her short life would be marked by darkness that no child should ever know, she held on to dreams of castles and crowns with the fierce determination that only the very young possess. Jersey was born on November 14, 2006, into a world that should have been filled with bedtime stories and birthday parties, playground laughter, and unconditional love. Instead, her story would become a haunting reminder of how the systems meant to protect the most vulnerable can fail, and how evil can lurk in the most ordinary places. The first signs that something was terribly wrong in Jersey's world came not with dramatic revelations, but with whispered concerns and worried glances from neighbors who noticed things weren't quite right at the Bridgeman house. Children's voices should fill homes with joy, but the sounds coming from Jersey's home were different, muffled, fearful, sometimes eerily silent. After her parents' divorce, Jersey found herself living with her father, David Bridgeman, and her stepmother, Jonna. What should have been a fresh start for a blended family instead became something far more sinister. The adults in Jersey's life, the very people who should have been her protectors, began to see her not as a precious child to be nurtured, but as a problem to be controlled. It started with complaints about Jersey's nighttime wandering. Like many children, Jersey would sometimes get up during the night, perhaps seeking a drink of water, perhaps simply unable to sleep, perhaps trying to escape nightmares that only she could see. But instead of addressing this normal childhood behavior with patience and understanding, David and Jonna Bridgeman chose a solution that would shock even hardened investigators when it was eventually discovered. The image is almost too horrific to contemplate. A small girl, barely out of toddlerhood, tethered like an animal to prevent her from moving freely in what should have been the safest place in her world. According to police records, Jersey herself would later tell investigators that Jonna and David chained her to the dresser because she had gotten up and eaten some pies, cereal, and bread, and that they put a belt around her waist so that she could not get up. The matter-of-fact way Jersey described her treatment revealed a heartbreaking truth. This had become her normal. A child who should have been learning about fairness and kindness in school was instead learning that love could be conditional, that safety was not guaranteed, and that the adults in her life could inflict pain without consequence. The horror of Jersey's situation might have remained hidden indefinitely, if not for the intervention of those trained to recognize the signs of abuse. In 2011, when Jersey was just 5 years old, child welfare workers became aware of her situation and began an investigation that would shock the community and make national headlines. A system that prevented her from moving freely. The physical discomfort was undoubtedly severe, but the psychological impact was immeasurable. How does a child process the knowledge that the people who claim to love her consider her such a burden that she must be physically restrained? Yet even in the midst of this nightmare, those who encountered Jersey in other settings, teachers, neighbors, family members, described her as a bright, resilient little girl who maintained an almost supernatural optimism. She loved princesses as many little girls do, perhaps finding in their stories of eventual triumph and happiness a hope that her own life might someday match those fairy tale endings. The dramatic irony of Jersey's situation was heartbreaking. While she dreamed of princesses who lived in beautiful castles, she was literally chained in her own bedroom, treated worse than many would treat a pet. The foreshadowing was equally ominous. A child who was already being treated as less than human by those who should have protected her was being set up for even greater tragedy. When the abuse was finally discovered, the criminal justice system moved swiftly to protect Jersey and punish her abusers. David and Jonna Bridgeman were charged and eventually pleaded guilty to multiple charges related to their treatment of Jersey. David received an 18-year prison sentence after pleading guilty to false imprisonment, permitting the abuse of a minor and endangering the welfare of a minor. Jonna received a 12-year sentence, plus 3 years for a probation revocation. The sentences were substantial, reflecting the severity of their crimes and the community's outrage at what had been done to an innocent child. Finally, it seemed, Jersey would be safe. Finally, she could begin to heal from the trauma she had endured and start to build the normal childhood that had been stolen from her. Jersey was placed in the care of her mother, where she began to show signs of the resilience that had carried her through her darkest moments. She was described as a loving big sister to her baby sister, and she maintained her fascination with princesses and fairy tales. Those who knew her during this period remembered a 6-year-old girl who loved princesses, her cat, and her baby sister. For a brief shining moment, it seemed as though Jersey's story might have a happy ending after all. The systems had worked, the bad guys had been punished, and a little girl was finally getting the chance to be just that, a little girl. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. In the small world of residential neighborhoods, neighbors often become like extended family, especially for children who see the same faces day after day as they play outside or walk to school. For Jersey, one of those familiar faces belonged to Zachary Holly, a 28-year-old man who lived next door to where she was staying with her mother. Holly was not a stranger to the family, quite the opposite. He had become a trusted figure in Jersey's life, someone who had babysat her on multiple occasions, and who seemed to genuinely care about her well-being. Court documents would later reveal that Holly had been babysitting the little girl the night before her disappearance, as he had many times before. The tragic irony of Jersey's situation was becoming clear. After surviving the horrors inflicted by her own father and stepmother, after being rescued by the system and placed in what should have been a safe environment, the greatest threat to her safety was living right next door, masquerading as a friend and protector. The very trust that Jersey's family had placed in him, allowing him to babysit her, to be part of her daily life, would ultimately be used against her in the most horrific way imaginable. The foreshadowing was subtle but present. Neighbors who knew Holly would later describe him as someone who seemed helpful and friendly, but who also had a history of behavior that, in retrospect, should have raised red flags. Like many predators, he had positioned himself carefully, building trust and establishing himself as a safe person before revealing his true nature. November 19th, 2012, was an ordinary evening in the Bridgeman household. Jersey, now 6 years old, and just days past her birthday, was settling into what had become a comfortable routine in her mother's care. The trauma of her early years was still with her, but she was beginning to show signs of healing and growth that gave everyone hope for her future. That evening, as he had done many times before, Zachary Holly came over to babysit Jersey. To her family, this was a normal arrangement with a trusted neighbor. Holly had proven himself reliable and caring, and Jersey seemed comfortable with it. There was no reason to suspect that this night would be any different from the many others when Holly had watched over her. Jersey went to bed that night with no knowledge that it would be her last. Perhaps she dreamed of princesses and castles, of growing up to be a nurse or a teacher, of all the birthdays and Christmases that stretched ahead of her. Perhaps she felt, for the first time in her short life, truly safe and loved. The dramatic irony of that final evening is almost unbearable to contemplate. While Jersey slept peacefully, trusting in the adults around her to keep her safe, one of those very adults was planning her destruction. The man she had come to trust, who had been given access to her most vulnerable moments, was preparing to betray that trust in the most devastating way possible. As the hours passed and the house grew quiet, Jersey's family settled in for what they believed would be just another ordinary night. They had no way of knowing that evil was already in their home, waiting for the right moment to strike. November 2012. Dawn gray and cold in Bentonville, the kind of late autumn morning when parents bundle their children up before sending them off to school, and when the promise of winter hangs heavy in the air. But this would not be an ordinary morning for the Bridgeman family. When Jersey's mother went to wake her daughter for school, she found an empty bed. The covers were disturbed, as if Jersey had gotten up during the night, but she was nowhere to be found. Initial thoughts turned to innocent explanations. Perhaps Jersey had gotten up early and was playing somewhere else in the house, or maybe she had wandered outside to play. But as the search of the house turned up nothing, those innocent explanations began to give way to a growing sense of panic. Jersey was not the type of child to wander off without permission, especially not so early in the morning. Something was wrong, terribly, urgently wrong. The call to police came quickly, and within minutes, officers were on the scene, beginning what they hoped would be a routine search for a missing child who had probably just wandered a little too far from home. They organized search teams, questioned neighbors, and began the methodical process of checking every possible location where a 6-year-old girl might have gone. But their search would be heartbreakingly brief. Just minutes after the search began, Jersey's body was discovered in an abandoned house just 2 doors down from her own home. The proximity of the location to her home was the first indication that this was not a case of a child who had wandered off and met. Someone had taken Jersey from her bed and brought her to this place of concealment. The abandoned house had become a tomb for a little girl who had already suffered more in her 6 years than most people endure in a lifetime. The irony was cruel and inescapable. Jersey, who had once been literally chained in her own bedroom, had now been found in another kind of prison, one from which there would be no rescue, no intervention by concerned authorities, no chance for healing and recovery. The medical examination would reveal the full horror of what had been done to Jersey. She had been sexually assaulted and died from asphyxiation. The physical evidence told a story of terror and pain that no child should ever experience, of final moments that were filled with confusion and fear, rather than the love and comfort every child deserves. The emotional resonance of the discovery rippled through the community like a physical blow. Here was a child who had already been failed by the system once, who had survived abuse at the hands of her own family members, who had been given a second chance at safety and happiness. And now, that chance had been stolen from her in the most brutal way imaginable. Chapter 8. The mask falls away. The investigation into Jersey's murder moved swiftly. The proximity of the crime scene to her home, combined with the intimate knowledge of her routines that the perpetrator must have possessed, pointed investigators towards someone close to the family. When they turned their attention to Zachary Hawley, the neighbor who had been babysitting Jersey just hours before her disappearance, the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with horrifying clarity. Hawley was arrested and charged with capital murder, kidnapping, and residential burglary. The charges reflected the full scope of his crimes. He had not only murdered Jersey, but had kidnapped her from her own home and violated the sanctity of the family's living space. The revelation that Hawley was the perpetrator sent shockwaves through everyone who had known and trusted him. Neighbors who had seen him as a helpful, caring person struggled to reconcile that image with the reality of what he had done. Jersey's family was forced to confront the fact that they had unknowingly placed their daughter in the hands of her killer, that their trust had been weaponized against the very person they were trying to protect. The dramatic irony of the situation was almost too much to bear. Hawley had positioned himself as Jersey's protector while secretly planning her destruction. Every act of kindness, every moment of apparent care, had been part of a calculated deception designed to gain access, to a vulnerable child. When Zachary Hawley's case went to trial, the full extent of his betrayal became clear. The prosecution presented forensic evidence that the jury found convincing, and on May 2015, Hawley was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to death, along with 2 life terms and 20 years in prison. The trial revealed the methodical nature of Hawley's crime. This was not a moment of impulse or a tragic accident, but a deliberate act of violence against a child who trusted him. The evidence showed that Hawley had used his position as a babysitter to gain intimate knowledge of Jersey's routines and vulnerabilities, then exploited that knowledge to commit the ultimate betrayal. For Jersey's surviving family members, the conviction brought a measure of justice, but no real comfort. No sentence, no matter how severe, could bring Jersey back or undo the trauma of losing her in such a horrific way. The knowledge that she had died at the hands of someone she trusted only added to their pain. Struggled to come to terms with what had happened. Parents questioned their own judgment about who they trusted with their children. Neighbors looked at each other with new suspicion, wondering what secrets might be hidden behind familiar faces. In the months and years following Hawley's conviction, the full impact of Jersey's murder continued to reverberate through her community and beyond. Her case had garnered national attention, not only because of the horrific nature of her death, but because of the context of abuse that had preceded it. Jersey's case garnered considerable international media attention in the US and Europe, and spurred debates about child protection because of the prior convictions and lengthy sentences for the perpetrators of abuse against her. The fact that a child who had already been rescued from one abusive situation had then fallen victim to an even more terrible crime raised difficult questions about how society. The story became a catalyst for discussions about background checks for babysitters, about the warning signs of predatory behavior, and about the ways that trust can be manipulated by those with evil intention. Jersey's death, while tragic beyond measure, served as a wake-up call for parents and communities everywhere. But perhaps most importantly, Jersey's story highlighted the resilience and hope that children can maintain even in the darkest circumstances. Despite everything she had endured, those who knew her remembered her as a child who still believed in princesses, who still loved her family, who still found joy in simple pleasures like playing with her cat or caring for her baby sister. Chapter 11. The weight of what might have been as the legal proceedings concluded and Holly began serving his sentence. Those who had known Jersey were left to grapple the weight of what might have been. She had been just 6 years old when her life ended, barely old enough to have formed lasting memories or to have developed a real sense of who she might become. The foreshadowing that had marked Jersey's life took on new and tragic meaning in retrospect. Her early abuse at the hands of her father and stepmother had been a warning sign, a red flag that she was a child at risk who needed extra protection and vigilance. The dramatic irony of her situation remained heartbreaking. Jersey had been removed from one dangerous situation only to be placed in another. The very qualities that made her a sympathetic victim, her youth, her vulnerability, her history of trauma, had also made her an attractive target for someone with predatory intentions. Jersey's mother and other family members were left to carry the burden of survivor's guilt, wondering if there were signs they should have seen, warnings they should have heeded. The knowledge that Holly had been in their home, caring for Jersey, on the very night before her murder, only intensified their anguish. Jersey Dianne Bridgeman's life was measured not in years, but in moments of joy, stolen between periods of suffering, moments of love shared despite the darkness that surrounded her, moments of hope maintained against all odds. Her story is one of a child who deserved so much more than the world gave her, but who somehow managed to maintain her essential goodness despite everything she endured. The emotional resonance of Jersey's story lies not just in the tragedy of her death, but in the courage she showed in life. Here was a child who had been literally chained by those who should have loved her, who had been betrayed by those who claimed to care for her, and yet who continued to love princesses and dream of better things. In the end, Jersey never got to grow up to become the princess she dreamed of being. She never got to rescue anyone or rule over a kingdom or find her happily ever after. But in her own way, she became something even more powerful, a symbol of the innocence that exists in every child, and the responsibility that every adult has to protect that innocence. Her case led to changes in how background checks are conducted for those who work with children, improvements in how child protective services monitor at-risk families, and increased awareness of the ways that predators can manipulate trust and access to gain proximity to potential victims. Today, Jersey Dianne Bridgeman rests in Bentonville Cemetery, her grave marked with tributes from a community that will never forget her. Visitors often leave small tokens, toy princesses, flowers, notes from other children who heard her story and wanted her to know she wasn't forgotten. The house where she lived has new occupants now, families who may not even know the tragic history that unfolded within those walls. The abandoned house where her body was found has been torn down, erasing the physical reminder of that terrible morning, but never erasing the memory of what happened there. Zachary Holly remains on death row, having exhausted his initial appeals. He continued to assert his innocence and seek an overturning of his conviction. But the evidence against him was overwhelming, the jury's verdict decisive. Jersey's father and stepmother continue to serve their prison sentences for the abuse they inflicted on her in the final years of her life. Their crimes, while horrific, pale in comparison to what Holly did, but they remain forever marked as the adults who failed a child when she needed them most. The greatest tragedy of Jersey's story is not just that she died, but that she died believing in princesses. She died still hoping for magic and happy endings, still trusting in the goodness of adults despite everything she had experienced. Her faith in the possibility of better things, maintained against all evidence to the contrary, serves as both an inspiration and a heartbreaking reminder of what was lost. In fairy tales, princesses are rescued by brave knights and go on to live happily ever after in beautiful castles. Jersey Bridgeman was never rescued, never got her happy ending, never found her castle. But her story serves as a call to action for all of us to be the knights she needed, to protect the other children who might be in danger, to ensure that her death was not in vain. Perhaps that is Jersey's true legacy, not the tragedy of how her story ended, but the challenge it presents to all of us to write better endings for the children who come after her. In a world where real princesses are vulnerable children in need of protection, we all have the opportunity to be heroes in the stories that matter most. Jersey Dianne Bridgeman, November 14th, 2006, November 2012. A little girl who believed in princesses and deserved to become one. May her memory inspire us to be better guardians of innocence, better protectors of childhood, and better champions for those who cannot speak for themselves. Jersey Dianne was a bright and beautiful 6-year-old who brought joy to everyone who knew her. She had a smile that could light up any room and a spirit full of curiosity and wonder that made every day an adventure. Jersey loved to play, laugh, and explore the world around her with the fearless enthusiasm that only a child possesses. Though her time with us was far too short, she filled those precious years with love, laughter, and countless sweet memories that her family and friends will treasure forever. Jersey's light continues to shine in the hearts of all who loved her, reminding us to cherish every moment and hold our loved ones close. She will never be forgotten, and her memory lives on as a testament to the pure joy and innocence she brought to this world.